History tends to preserve the thunderous moments, the stirring speeches, the clash of armies, and the scenes where a single courageous figure steps forward and everything changes in an instant. So we remember seas dividing before fleeing crowds, fortified walls collapsing without a hand touching them, and a young shepherd standing in a valley before a giant. Because these are the images that grip the imagination. Dramatic, unmistakable, overwhelming in their display of divine power. The kind of events that seem to leave no room for doubt that heaven has intervened in the affairs of humanity. Yet some of the most decisive shifts in history arrive without spectacle, unfolding instead in stillness, in the quiet hours of an ordinary night when a ruler cannot sleep and does not know why, and when a long-forgotten name is spoken softly within palace walls, when years of unnoticed faithfulness suddenly converge into a single moment that alters the destiny of a people. And it is this kind of turning point that forms the heart of the story, set within the vast Persian Empire under King Xerxes, during the time when the Jewish people lived scattered in exile across 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. At the center stands Morai, a man who took his place day after day at the king's gate, not to seek recognition, not to manipulate influence, not to secure advancement for himself, but simply to serve with integrity, remaining loyal to his people, devoted to his God, and committed to truth even when such loyalty brought no applause and offered no visible reward. And through that steady obedience, he became woven into a deliverance that would come not through armies marching across battlefields or miracles blazing across the sky, but through a restless night, precisely timed words, courageous restraint, and the unseen orchestration of providence moving quietly through ordinary events. This is the story of Marai's vigil, not merely one critical evening, but a lifetime of consistency, of character formed in obscurity, of courage sustained when compromise would have been easier, and of integrity preserved when no one appeared to be watching, revealing that God often works not through spectacle, but through steadfastness, not through overwhelming displays of force, but through patient faithfulness, not through voices that dominate the crowd, but through hearts that refuse to bend, until at last a single night arrives that saves a nation, made possible only because years of unseen preparation had already been laid in silence. Exiles in a foreign empire. The Persian Empire was the superpower of the ancient world, a sprawling domain that encompassed everything from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Mediterranean. From the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Egypt, it was a world of opulence and power unlike anything that had come before, where the royal palace in Susa gleamed with marble columns and golden fixtures, where the winter palace at Pepalolis showcased the tribute of nations, where royal decrees could reshape entire populations with a stroke of the royal seal. King Xerxes, known in Persian as Kayasha, the great king, king of kings, ruled over this vast empire with absolute authority. His word was law. His decisions were final. His power seemed unlimited. And somewhere within this vast empire, scattered across its cities and provinces, living in communities from Babylon to Sardis, from Memphis to Epatana, lived the Jewish people. Exiles whose ancestors had been carried away from Jerusalem generations earlier when the Babylonians conquered their homeland. It had been well over a century since the destruction of Solomon's temple, since the walls of Jerusalem were breached, since the leading citizens of Judah were marched into captivity. Many had returned to rebuild Jerusalem when the Persians allowed it under Cyrus and his successors, but many more had remained in the lands of their exile, building new lives in foreign soil. Most of the Jews living in Persia had never seen Jerusalem. They had been born in Persia, raised in Persia, built lives and businesses and families in Persia. They spoke Aramaic and Persian as fluently as Hebrew. They dressed in Persian style and participated in Persian commerce. Yet they carried within them the memory of who they were, a people chosen by the one true God, a people with a covenant stretching back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a people with promises yet to be fulfilled. They maintained their distinct identity even as they adapted to life in a foreign land. They kept the Sabbath, they observed the festivals, they taught their children the stories of their ancestors. They lived as strangers in a foreign land, never quite belonging, never quite assimilating, holding on to an identity that transcended geography. Among these exiles was a man named Mori, son of Jair, son of Shemi, son of Kish, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin. His lineage connected him to the royal tribe from which King Saul had come, though those days of Jewish monarchy were long past. Morai held a position at the king's gate in Susa, not the physical gate of the city walls, but the administrative center where official business was conducted, where legal matters were decided, where petitions were heard, where the daily machinery of imperial government turned. It was a position of some importance, requiring literacy, knowledge of law, discretion, and trustworthiness. Those who sat at the king's gate were officials who represented royal authority in day-to-day governance. The gate was more than just an administrative office. It was a place of visibility and vulnerability. Officials there were exposed to the comings and goings of court life, to the shifting winds of political fortune, to the intrigues and power plays that characterize life in any royal court. It required wisdom to navigate these waters successfully. You had to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait, when to stand on principle and when to exercise diplomatic flexibility. Morai was faithful in his duties. He dressed in the simple robes of a court official. He carried out his responsibilities with diligence and competence. He spoke when necessary and remained silent when wisdom demanded it. He was not flashy or self-promoting, but neither was he invisible. He was known as reliable, honest, observant, qualities that would prove crucial in ways he could not yet imagine. But Morai carried something else with him, a deep commitment to his people and to the faith that defined them. When his uncle died, leaving behind an orphan daughter named Hadassah, Morai had taken her in and raised her as his own. He had guided her with love and wisdom, teaching her the ways of their people, while also helping her navigate life in Persian society. The name Hadassah meant myrtle in Hebrew, but she was also known by her Persian name Esther, which may have derived from the Persian word for star, or possibly from the name of the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. This dual identity, Jewish in heritage, Persian in culture, would become significant in ways neither of them could have anticipated. When King Xerxes divorced his queen Vashti for refusing to display herself at a royal banquet and ordered a kingdom-wide search for beautiful young women who might become the new queen, Esther was among those taken into the royal harem. It was not a choice. Beautiful young women throughout the empire were conscripted into this process, given a year of beauty treatments and preparation before being presented to the king. For a Jewish family, this was a complicated and difficult situation. Yet Morai advised Esther to conceal her Jewish identity during this process. It was not shame that motivated the secrecy, but prudence, an understanding that in a world of political intrigue and shifting power, wisdom sometimes required discretion. When Esther won the king's favor and became queen, crowned and celebrated throughout the empire, Morai did not seek special favor. He did not leverage his connection to the queen for personal gain. He did not request promotions or privileges. He continued his quiet service at the gate, watching over his adopted daughter from a distance, concerned for her welfare, but respecting the boundaries of her new position. He walked by the courtyard of the harem regularly to learn how she was and what was happening to her, but always from a careful distance, never drawing attention to their relationship. He lived as so many faithful people have lived throughout history, doing what was right day after day, without fanfare, without applause, without immediate reward, simply because it was right. He went to work, he fulfilled his duties, he kept his commitments, he maintained his integrity in small things, unaware that his faithfulness in the mundane details of daily life was preparing him for a crisis that would threaten the very existence of his people. Years passed this way. Esther adjusted to life as queen. Mordecai continued his service at the gate. The Jewish people throughout the empire continued their lives working, worshiping, raising families, contributing to Persian society while maintaining their distinct identity. Everything seemed stable. Everything seemed ordinary. No one could see the storm that was gathering on the horizon, or the way that seemingly insignificant choices and relationships were being positioned like pieces on a game board, ready for a moment when everything would matter. Power in the Persian court was a delicate and dangerous thing, constantly shifting and constantly renegotiated. The king's favor could lift a man to extraordinary heights or cast him down into oblivion. Nobles competed for position, for influence, for the king's attention. Alliances formed and dissolved. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface of courtly politeness. It was a world where perception mattered as much as reality, where maintaining honor and status required constant vigilance, and where a single misstep or perceived insult could carry devastating consequences. Into this world of carefully balanced authority and fragile egos came a man named Haman, son of Hamatha the Agite. The designation Agite was significant to anyone who knew Jewish history. Agag had been king of the Amalekites, the ancient enemies of Israel, whom King Saul had been commanded to destroy completely, but instead spared, an act of disobedience that cost Saul his kingdom. The Amalekites had been the first nation to attack Israel after the exodus from Egypt, striking the weak and vulnerable stragglers at the rear of the column. Because of this cruelty, God had declared perpetual hostility between Israel and Amalek. So when Hman is identified as an Agite, it signals to those who understand that this is not merely a bureaucratic appointment, but the continuation of an ancient enmity. King Xerxes elevated Haman above all the other nobles, giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other officials. He was made second only to the king himself in authority and power. With this elevation came a decree, reflecting the Persian understanding of honor and hierarchy. All the royal officials at the king's gate were to kneel and pay honor to Haman whenever he passed by. This was not merely a gesture of respect, but an act of submission, a public acknowledgement of Haman's elevated status, a daily ritual reinforcing the power structure each time it was performed. Every day as Haman passed through the gate in his splendid robes, officials bowed. Oh, they bent the knee. They lowered their eyes and offered the gestures of submission that Persian protocol demanded. Every official, that is, except one. Mordecai remained standing day after day while everyone around him knelt. He stood upright. He did not make a spectacle of his refusal. He did not shout or draw attention to himself. He simply did not bow. The other officials at the gate noticed immediately. They questioned Mordecai. "Why do you disobey the king's command?" They asked him repeatedly, day after day, but he refused to comply. Finally, wanting to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, they told Mon about it. They reported that Mordecai had said he was a Jew, as though this explanation somehow accounted for his refusal. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was not personal animosity toward Haman. It was not political rebellion against the king. For Mordecai, bowing to Haman would have meant offering a form of reverence that belonged to God alone. The Jewish people had been given clear instruction from the beginning. They were to worship no one but the Lord. "You shall have no other gods before me," the first commandment declared. "You shall not bow down to them or worship them." Throughout their history, this had been the defining boundary, the line that could not be crossed. Daniel's friends had refused to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's golden image and had been thrown into a fiery furnace. Daniel himself had continued to pray to God, despite a decree forbidding it, and had been cast into a den of lions. For a faithful Jew, there were things more important than safety, more important than advancement, more important even than life itself. So Marai stood day after day, even as tension mounted, even as the other officials questioned him, even as word reached Mon. He stood not because he was bold, but because he was faithful. He stood not because he wished to make a statement, but because he could not, in good conscience, do otherwise. He stood because some lines cannot be crossed, even when crossing them would be easier, safer, and more convenient. When Haman learned that Marai refused to kneel, his reaction was neither measured nor proportionate. He was not merely annoyed or disappointed. He was filled with rage, a consuming, overwhelming fury that distorted everything. Here was the second most powerful man in the empire, honored by the king, elevated above all the nobles, feared throughout the court, and yet this one Jewish official would not bow. The insult burned, and the perceived disrespect festered. The wound to Haishman's pride ran deep, but Haishman was cunning as well as proud. He realized that punishing Marai alone would not satisfy his wounded ego or restore his sense of honor. If Marai were executed, it would be a single punishment, over and done, quickly forgotten. But if Marai's refusal was rooted in his Jewish identity, if it was his Jewishness that prevented him from bowing, then Haman could strike not only at the man, but at his entire people. He could transform a personal grievance into a matter of state security. He could convert wounded pride into a campaign of annihilation. It was a terrifying leap from personal offense to mass violence. Yet in the corridors of absolute power, such leaps occur more easily than we might imagine. Mon began to plan. He began to calculate. He gathered information about the Jewish people scattered throughout the empire, their numbers, their locations, their customs, their vulnerabilities. He laid the groundwork for what he intended to be the complete destruction of every Jewish man, woman, and child within the Persian Empire. The danger was real, the threat was existential, and most of the Jewish people had no idea it was forming. They went about their daily lives, working in their trades, celebrating their festivals, raising their children, never imagining that in the royal court a plot was taking shape that would one day mark them all for death. Mon came before King Xerxes with a proposal carefully constructed for maximum effect. He was too calculating to mention Marai by name, or to reveal that this began as a personal insult. Framing it that way would have sounded small, a vindictive, beneath the dignity of imperial concern. Instead, he clothed his intentions in the language of statecraft, security, order, loyalty, and even financial gain for the crown. The moment he chose was deliberate. It was the first month of the 12th year of Xerxes' reign, a detail that would later carry great weight. Before approaching the king, Haman cast lots, pur in the Persian tongue, to determine the most favorable date to carry out his design. The lot selected the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar, granting him nearly an entire year to prepare. He was systematic, patient, willing to wait for what he believed would be the perfect alignment of time and power. When he spoke, his tone was measured, the voice of a loyal advisor alerting his sovereign to a potential danger. "There is a certain people," he began, "scattered among the populations in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their customs differ from those of others, and they do not keep the king's laws. It is not in the king's interest to tolerate them." Each phrase was chosen with care. "Scattered among the provinces" made them sound like a hidden network rather than an established minority. "Their customs differ" stirred suspicion of separateness within a vast and diverse empire. "They do not keep the king's laws" was the most serious charge of all, suggesting disloyalty and rebellion against imperial authority. In reality, these accusations were distortions. The Jews did maintain distinct traditions, but so did many groups across Persia. They followed their own religious laws, yet they were largely peaceful, contributing members of society who paid taxes and lived quietly within their communities. The only specific act of defiance Mon could point to was Marai's refusal to bow to him, hardly proof of organized rebellion. But evidence was unnecessary. Suggestion was enough. In a sprawling empire vulnerable to unrest, even a hint of internal threat could provoke decisive action. Then Hman added an incentive. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction, and I will contribute 10,000 talents of silver to the royal treasury. The amount was staggering, perhaps equal to two-thirds of the empire's annual revenue. Such wealth could finance wars, expand infrastructure, reward loyal governors. The silver would likely come from confiscated Jewish property, their homes, businesses, savings seized after their deaths. In effect, Shimon was proposing to transform mass killing into financial gain for the state. Whether persuaded by the argument or simply indifferent to the fate of a minority population, King Xerxes agreed. He removed his signet ring, the symbol of royal authority, and placed it in Haman's hand. The ring bore the imperial seal. Any document impressed with it carried the full weight of the king's command. By giving it to Haman, Xerxes authorized him to draft and issue whatever decree he desired in the king's name. Keep the money, the king said, brushing aside the offer as though the financial details were insignificant. Do with the people as you see fit. With that casual consent, the destiny of an entire nation was entrusted to one man's fury. Mon acted swiftly. On the 13th day of the first month, he summoned the royal scribes. They prepared orders addressed to the satraps, governors, and nobles across the empire, written in every provincial script and translated into every local language. The decree bore the name of King Xerxes and was sealed with the royal ring. Couriers carried the command to every province to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single appointed day, the 13th of Adar, and to seize their possessions. The wording was deliberate and forceful: destroy, kill, annihilate. No ambiguity, no allowance for mercy. Every Jewish person within the empire was marked for death. The plan was chilling in its precision. This was not spontaneous violence erupting from a mob. It was an officially sanctioned campaign, structured by bureaucracy, empowered by law, endorsed by the throne. Copies of the edict were displayed publicly in every province so that all peoples would be prepared for the appointed day. The couriers hurried out under royal command. The decree was proclaimed in the citadel of Susa. Then comes a detail that exposes the moral emptiness at the heart of power. The king and Haman sat down to drink. They relaxed together, satisfied that a perceived problem had been resolved, unmoved by the human cost of their decision. Meanwhile, the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Citizens were bewildered, troubled by the sudden announcement condemning an entire people. Even those who felt no affection for the Jews sensed that something was deeply wrong, that this was not ordinary governance but something darker and more dangerous. The edict carried the king's name and seal. It possessed the full authority of Persian law, and in Persia, once a royal decree was issued and sealed, it could not be revoked. It was final, binding, irreversible. The machinery of destruction had been set in motion, and from every visible angle, there appeared to be no way to halt it. When news of the decree reached the Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire, the reaction was immediate and visceral. In every province where the edict was proclaimed, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes, the traditional signs of grief and repentance, the outward expression of inward devastation. Marai learned of everything that had been done, not only the public decree, but also the details of how it had unfolded, Mon's role in arranging it, and even the specific amount of money that had been promised. As someone stationed at the king's gate, he had access to information and whispered conversations that ordinary citizens would never hear. When he grasped the full scope of the threat, his response was both profound and unmistakably public. He tore his clothes, a sign of extreme grief in the ancient Near Eastern world, a visible declaration that something catastrophic had occurred. He put on sackcloth, the rough garment worn in mourning, and covered himself with ashes. Then he went out into the city, crying out loudly and bitterly. This was not private sorrow expressed behind closed doors. It was public lamentation, a cry of anguish that refused to be silenced, a visible protest against injustice. He went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was permitted to enter that space. Yet his location was intentional. He positioned himself where he would be seen, where word of his distress would reach the palace, where Esther's attendants would notice and report back to the queen. Esther's attendants and eunuchs came and told her about Morai, and the queen was deeply troubled. She did not yet understand what had happened or why Morai appeared in such a state. Her first reaction was practical. She sent garments for him to wear instead of sackcloth so that he could enter the palace and explain the matter properly. But Morai refused the clothing. This was not about personal comfort or appearance. It was about ensuring that Esther understood the seriousness of the crisis and could not soften or dismiss it. Esther then summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and instructed him to learn what was troubling Morai and why he was acting in this way. Hathach went out to Morai in the open square of the city before the king's gate, and Morai told him everything, not merely that a decree had been issued, but the entire account, how Ishman had engineered it, the exact sum of money he had pledged to the royal treasury, and the specific date appointed for destruction. Morai also gave Hathach a copy of the edict that had been published in Susa. He wanted Esther to see it for herself, to read the precise wording, to understand that this was not rumor or exaggeration, but official imperial policy. Then he sent a message that cut through palace protocol and political caution. He urged Esther to go before the king, to beg for mercy, and to plead with him on behalf of her people. This was the moment when the hidden connection became decisive. For years, Esther's Jewish identity had remained concealed. She had lived within the palace as queen, participating in court life, appearing at official functions, fulfilling her public role, yet never disclosing her heritage. Only Morai, and perhaps a few trusted servants, knew the truth. Her life had been built on discretion, on the careful separation between who she was privately and who she appeared to be publicly. Now Morai was asking her to risk everything, to reveal her identity, to align herself openly with a condemned people, to step directly into danger. He was asking her to use her royal position to intervene, to approach the king with a plea for mercy, and to expose herself to potential death for the sake of her nation. Hathach returned to Esther and relayed Morai's message. Esther's first response revealed both her fear and the genuine peril of what was being asked. She sent a reply through Hathach. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, there is but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. This was not mere etiquette or court custom. It was Persian law, and it was enforced with deadly seriousness. To enter the king's presence uninvited was a capital offense, punishable by immediate execution. The sole exception was if the king chose to extend his gold scepter, a gesture of acceptance and mercy. Yet whether he would extend it depended entirely on his will. There was no predicting it, no securing it in advance. It rested solely on the king's disposition at that precise moment. Esther added a detail that carried its own weight. 30 days had passed since she had been summoned. For a full month, the king had not called for her. She had no assurance that she still enjoyed his favor. Perhaps his interest had cooled. Perhaps another woman had captured his attention. Queens in the Persian court did not occupy unshakable positions. They could be dismissed, replaced, forgotten. Vashti had learned that when she defied the king and was swiftly deposed. Esther had no certainty that she would be welcomed if she entered unsummoned. What she was truly saying was simple and deeply human. I am afraid. If I do this, I could die, and I do not even know whether the king still looks upon me with favor. It has been a month since he called for me. Her response was honest. It was understandable. She was being asked to risk her life without any guarantee of success at a time when she had no recent evidence of the king's affection or approval. The danger was real. The fear was real. And Marai would need to answer her in a way that acknowledged that risk while helping her see why, despite everything, it could not be avoided. Marai's reply to Esther's fear stands as one of the most powerful moments in the entire narrative. In just a few sentences, he wove together confrontation and encouragement, realism and conviction, warning and hope. His words were neither harsh nor sentimental. They were steady, clear, and charged with meaning. He sent back this message. Do not imagine that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows whether you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Within these lines, there is an extraordinary depth. Marai began by confronting the instinct that surfaces in moments of danger, the belief that silence can shield us, that neutrality can preserve us, that if we avoid involvement, the storm may pass without touching us. He spoke plainly to Esther. Your royal residence will not guarantee your survival. The palace will not insulate you from the consequences of this decree. If the edict proceeds unchecked, you will not remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, your identity will be discovered, whether through deliberate investigation, betrayal, or the chaos of violence itself. Doing nothing will not secure your safety. Inaction will not equal protection. Yet Marai did not stop at warning. He declared something far more profound. Relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. He did not frame this as possibility or fragile optimism. He did not say perhaps or hopefully. He spoke with certainty. Deliverance will come. Somehow, in some manner beyond immediate sight, the Jewish people would not be erased. This confidence was not naive. It was rooted in covenantal faith. It flowed from trust in the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, from the conviction that God's purposes for Israel could not be undone by a court official's hatred. Persian authority, though vast, was not ultimate. Human decrees did not nullify divine commitments. At the same time, Marai made clear that Esther's choice still mattered. If she chose silence, deliverance might come through other means, but she and her father's household would perish. She would forfeit the privilege of participation. She would step aside from the very purpose for which she might have been positioned. The tragedy would not only be national, but personal, missing the moment for which her life had been arranged. Then came the question that has resonated across generations. Who knows whether you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? It was not a claim of prophetic certainty. It was an invitation to perspective. Esther had not pursued the crown. She had been taken into the royal harem alongside many others. She had gained favor through qualities she did not entirely engineer. She had been elevated at a precise moment in history, when Marai was at the gate, when Haman was ascending in power, when a hidden threat was forming against her people. Was this convergence accidental, or was there intention woven into the timing? Marai did not presume to map out God's hidden design. The phrase "who knows" acknowledges mystery, yet it suggests that lives are sometimes arranged ahead of crises, that positions of influence may be entrusted long before their purpose becomes visible, that what appears to be chance may in fact be preparation. Perhaps Esther's story had been unfolding toward this very hour. And this question extends beyond her moment. What if our circumstances are not random? What if our opportunities, relationships, and positions are not solely for comfort or advancement, but for service when it is most needed? What if the very situation that frightens us is the reason we have been placed where we are? Esther faced a decision. She could cling to personal safety, hoping to preserve status and security, though even that might ultimately fail, or she could accept the risk, trust that her elevation carried meaning beyond herself, and step into a purpose larger than comfort. Her answer revealed that something within her had shifted. She sent word, "Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." The decision was settled. Yet notice what came before action. 3 days of fasting. This was not reckless impulse or dramatic bravado. It was preparation. Before approaching the throne, Esther called for communal fasting. In the biblical tradition, fasting signified dependence on God, humility, and a plea for divine intervention. It was an acknowledgement that courage alone would not secure success, that persuasion alone would not determine the outcome. I and my attendants will fast as you do. In those words, Esther aligned herself fully with her people. No longer was she maintaining distance between her royal identity and her heritage. She embraced solidarity. She stood with them in vulnerability, claiming openly the connection she had once concealed. When this is done, I will go to the king, though it is against the law." She understood precisely what she was undertaking. She was not minimizing the danger or disguising the reality. She knew she would be violating a statute punishable by death. The risk was unmistakable. And if I perish, I perish. These words do not express despair, nor do they reflect a longing for martyrdom. They reveal acceptance, the recognition that some causes outweigh self-preservation, that there are moments when survival cannot be the highest aim. Courage in this instance was not the absence of fear, but the resolve to move forward despite it. Courage was preceded by consecration. Before stepping into uncertainty, she sought spiritual strength. Before confronting the king, she gathered communal support. Before risking everything, she anchored herself in prayerful dependence. And so the stage was prepared. The Jewish community fasted. Esther and her attendants fasted. Hearts were steadied. Resolve was strengthened. After 3 days, she would clothe herself in royal robes and walk into the inner court, where her destiny would be decided in a single breath. Would the king extend the golden scepter and grant her life, or would he command her execution for daring to enter uninvited? The sleepless night. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes. These were not just beautiful clothes, but symbols of authority and status, garments that reminded everyone who saw her that she was the queen. She was not approaching as a supplicant or a servant, but as the king's wife, though even that position offered no guarantee of safety. Then she went and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The text emphasizes this: she found favor in his sight. This was not guaranteed. This could have gone differently. But in that moment, for reasons we cannot fully explain, the king looked at Esther and was favorably disposed toward her. He extended the gold scepter that was in his hand toward Esther. It was the signal of acceptance, the gesture that meant she would not die. She was invited to approach. She had survived the first hurdle. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. This was the appropriate response, the gesture of respect and acknowledgement of the king's authority and mercy. And the immediate danger had passed. She was alive. The king was willing to hear what she had to say. "What is it, Queen Esther?" the king asked. "What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you. This was standard royal hyperbole. Offering up to half the kingdom was a way of expressing generous willingness to grant a favor, not a literal offer to give away half the empire. But it indicated that the king was well disposed toward her, that he was ready to be generous, that her request would likely be granted. And yet Esther did not blurt out her request. She did not immediately reveal the plot or name Haman as the villain. Instead, she moved with careful strategy. If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. It was an invitation to a private banquet. Just the king, Esther, and Haman. The king agreed immediately, delighted by the personal attention. Bring Haman at once, he ordered, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. At the banquet, as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Again the opportunity was there. Again she could have made her request, but again she deferred. "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." A second delay, a second banquet requested. Why? The text does not explicitly tell us Esther's reasoning, but we can observe what the delay accomplished. It built suspense. It kept the king's curiosity engaged. It gave Haman time to overreach, to reveal more of his character. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed time for something else to happen, something that no one could have planned or predicted. Haman left the banquet that evening in high spirits. He was riding the absolute peak of his power and influence. The king had honored him above all other nobles. The queen had invited him to an exclusive private banquet, and then invited him to another one the next day. He was at the center of attention, singled out for honor, seemingly untouchable in his position of authority. He called his friends and his wife Zeresh to boast about his good fortune. He told them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and elevated him above the other nobles and officials. Then he added, "And that's not all. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me, along with the king, tomorrow." Everything was perfect. Everything was going his way. He was powerful, wealthy, honored, and apparently beloved. But then his mood shifted dramatically. "Yet all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." It is a stunning admission. Haman had everything most people would want: wealth beyond measure, many sons, a sign of blessing in ancient culture, the king's favor, the queen's attention, a position of supreme authority. And yet all of it meant nothing because one man would not bow to him. One man's refusal to acknowledge his greatness poisoned every other success. This reveals the depth of Haman's pride and the emptiness at his core. No amount of honor would ever be enough. No achievement would ever satisfy. As long as one person refused to acknowledge his superiority, he could not be happy. His wife Zeresh and all his friends had a suggestion. Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. 50 cubits was approximately 75 feet, an enormous height designed to make the execution visible throughout the city, a public demonstration of what happened to those who defied Haman. The suggestion delighted him. He had the pole set up immediately, eager for morning to come so he could request Mordecai's execution from the king and then go enjoy the queen's second banquet with his enemy finally destroyed. Everything was in place. Haman's plan seemed perfect. He would ask the king for Mordecai's death in the morning, attend the banquet in triumph, and watch his enemy be impaled on a pole tall enough for the entire city to see. Within hours, his last source of dissatisfaction would be eliminated. But that same night, something happened that would change everything. Something that no one could have planned, predicted, or arranged through human effort alone. The king could not sleep. That's it. That's the detail on which everything would turn. King Xerxes, on that particular night, could not fall asleep. There was no illness. There was no noise or disturbance. It was not worry or anxiety that the text mentions. It was simply one of those nights when sleep would not come, when the mind stays alert despite the body's tiredness, when the hours stretch long and rest remains elusive. So the king ordered that the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, be brought in and read to him. Perhaps he hoped the dry recitation of official records would help him fall asleep. Perhaps he simply wanted distraction from his wakefulness. Court chronicles in the ancient world recorded significant events, honors bestowed, threats averted, official business conducted. They were detailed, thorough, and not particularly exciting to listen to. Perfect material for inducing sleep. And as the records were read aloud in the quiet of the night, as the king lay there listening to the accounting of his reign, and the reader came upon an entry from several years earlier. It was an account of how Mordecai had discovered a conspiracy. Two of the king's officers, Bigthana and Teresh, who guarded the doorway, had become angry with the king and conspired to assassinate him. Mordecai had learned of the plot somehow, perhaps through his position at the gate, perhaps through connections who heard things, and he had reported it to Queen Esther, giving her the information. Esther had reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. The king had investigated, found the charges to be true, and had the two conspirators impaled on poles. The realm had been secured. The king's life had been saved. The king interrupted the reading. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" he asked. His attendants checked the records. "Nothing has been done for him," they answered. "Nothing." The man who had saved the king's life, who had exposed a conspiracy that would have resulted in the king's assassination, who had demonstrated extraordinary loyalty by reporting the plot rather than remaining silent or even joining it, this man had never been rewarded. The service had been noted in the official records and then forgotten. The debt had never been acknowledged. Justice had been delayed for years. It was a moment of clarity in the middle of a sleepless night. A realization that something was wrong, that an injustice had occurred through neglect, that a debt remained unpaid, that something needed to be set right. And the king's mind focused on this problem. How should Mordecai be honored? What would be appropriate recognition for someone who had saved the king's life? And just then, just as this question was forming in the king's mind, just as dawn was breaking after the king's sleepless night, Haman entered the outer court of the palace. He had come early, eager to catch the king at the first opportunity, ready to request permission to impale Mordecai on the pole he had set up. He was full of anticipation, imagining the satisfaction of watching his enemy die, thinking about how he would enjoy the queen's banquet once this last irritation was eliminated. The timing was exquisite in its precision, the king wrestling with how to honor Mordecai and Haman arriving to request his execution. The king wondering what to do for the man who saved his life, and Haman eager to destroy that same man. Two purposes, diametrically opposed, converging at the exact same moment. The turning point. The king's attendants announced that Haman was in the court, waiting for an audience. "Bring him in," the king said. And when Haman entered, still full of confidence, still anticipating the request he was about to make, the king asked him a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman's heart must have soared. What else could the king be thinking of but honoring him? Who else had recently been singled out for the queen's exclusive attention? Who else was riding such a wave of royal favor? Surely the king wanted to honor him even further, to add yet another layer of recognition to his already elevated status. So Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" And he answered the king's question by describing a fantasy of public glory, an extravagant display that would announce his status to everyone in the city. "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" It was a ceremony that would blur the line between king and subject, temporarily elevating the honored person almost to royal status. Wearing the king's own robe, riding the king's own horse, being led through the streets by a noble prince, while proclamations announced the king's delight in him. It was a public coronation of honor, a spectacle that everyone would see and remember, an affirmation that would be talked about for years. Haman could already see it. He could imagine himself in the royal robe, sitting on the royal horse, hearing the proclamations echo through the streets, watching people bow and acknowledge his greatness. Even Mordecai would have to see it, would have to witness Haman's ultimate triumph, would have to acknowledge, just before being impaled, that Haman had won completely. Then the king spoke, and with 6 words Haman's world collapsed. "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." The words hit Haman like a physical blow. Mordecai. The king wanted to honor Mordecai, not Haman, but the very man Haman had come to destroy. Not his ally, but his enemy. Not the person who bowed, but the person who refused to bow. And the king was commanding Haman himself to perform the ceremony, to be the noble prince who would lead Mordecai through the streets to proclaim his enemy's honor with his own voice. There was no escape. There was no way to refuse or deflect. The king had given a direct command, using language that was emphatic. "Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Every detail Haman had suggested in his moment of proud fantasy would now have to be carried out for the benefit of the man he most despised. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He found Mordecai at the king's gate, this man who had never bowed to him, who had frustrated his pride, who he had intended to execute within hours. And Haman, second only to the king in authority, had to dress Mordecai in the king's robe, help him onto the king's horse, and then lead him on foot through the city streets while proclaiming before him, over and over, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Every step was agony. Every proclamation was humiliation. The reversal was complete. Haman had positioned himself above Mordecai and now found himself literally beneath him, walking while Mordecai rode, announcing Mordecai's honor while his own pride was crushed. The man he had planned to impale was now being celebrated as a hero, and Haman himself was the unwilling instrument of his enemy's exaltation. The procession would have gone through the main streets, past the marketplace, through the areas where crowds would gather. Everyone would have seen it. Everyone would have heard Haman's proclamation. The news would spread quickly. The king was honoring Mordecai the Jew, and Haman himself was serving as his herald. Questions would be asked. Why was Mordecai being honored? What had he done? The story of the assassination plot years earlier would be retold. Mordecai's loyalty would be praised, and Haman's status, his authority, his ability to command respect, would be undermined by this very public role reversal. When the ceremony was finally over, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He simply resumed his position, his service, his quiet presence at the gate. He had not sought this honor. He had not asked for recognition. It had been given to him, and he accepted it with the same steady humility with which he had lived all along. But Haman rushed home, his head covered in grief. the traditional sign of mourning and shame. He told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened. The contrast with the previous evening could not have been more stark. The night before, he had been boasting about his wealth, his sons, his honors, his unique relationship with the queen. Now he was broken, humiliated, reporting his complete reversal of fortune. And his wife and advisors, who the previous night had encouraged him to build the pole and destroy Mordecai, now spoke words that must have felt like prophecy. Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. They saw what Haman could not yet fully grasp, that forces beyond his control were at work, that his humiliation of that morning was not just a setback, but the beginning of his complete destruction, that he had set in motion events that would now consume him. The very identity he had despised, Mordecai's Jewishness, was connected somehow to Haman's downfall. His advisors were essentially telling him that he had made a terrible mistake, that he was on the wrong side of something larger than palace politics, that his fate was now sealed. While they were still talking, while Haman was still reeling from the morning's events, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried him away to the banquet Esther had prepared. There was no time to recover, no opportunity to regroup or plan. He had to go directly from his humiliation to the queen's banquet, trying to compose himself, trying to understand what was happening, carrying with him the growing dread that his world was collapsing. The second banquet was about to begin, and Haman had no idea that the real blow was still to come. Esther's revelation. At the banquet, as they drank wine and the meal progressed, King Xerxes asked Esther the same question he had asked twice before. Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. This time, Esther answered. The moment of revelation had arrived. Her voice was steady, but her words cut through the pleasant atmosphere of the banquet like a sword. If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. The statement was devastating in its simplicity. The queen was asking for her life, not for wealth, not for honor, not for political advantage, but for the most basic thing, permission to continue living. And she was asking for her people, a people the king probably did not even realize she belonged to be spared from destruction. The reference to being sold echoed Haman's offer to pay money into the treasury. Esther was making clear that this was not just an administrative decision, but a commercial transaction, a genocide offered up for profit. And her final comment, that if it had merely been slavery, she would have remained silent, emphasized the absolute nature of the threat. Slavery would be terrible, but survivable. Destruction, killing, annihilation, these were final. And these left no room for hope or recovery. King Xerxes responded with shock and anger. Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. Notice the king's reaction. He did not immediately remember his own role in this. He did not recall giving his signet ring to Haman or approving the edict. In his mind, this was something someone else had done, some villain who had dared to threaten the queen. It reveals how casually the king had agreed to Haman's plan, how little he had paid attention to the details, how disconnected he was from the consequences of his own decisions. Esther answered by pointing directly at the person reclining at the banquet. An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. The accusation hung in the air. Haman, who had been invited to this exclusive banquet, who had been honored by the queen's personal attention, who thought he was the favored guest, he was being named as the villain, the enemy, the source of the threat. And suddenly everything made sense. The two banquets, the building suspense, the careful timing. Esther had not been honoring Haman. She had been setting him up for this moment of exposure. Terror seized Haman before the king and queen. He realized in an instant that everything was lost. His plot was exposed. His enemy was favored by the king. His own life was now in danger. The queen he thought was honoring him was actually his accuser. All his plans, all his schemes, all his pride, it collapsed in that single moment. The king was so furious that he got up and went out into the palace garden. He was too enraged to remain in the room, and too angry to trust himself to respond immediately. He needed space, needed to process what he had just learned, that his own decree, issued with his own seal, had threatened his own wife's life. Haman, seeing that the king had already decided his fate, seeing the fury in the king's exit, realized he had only moments to try to save himself. He threw himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, pleading for his life, begging for mercy from the very person he had planned to destroy. And just then, as the king returned from the garden, he saw Haman falling on the couch where the queen was reclining. In his rage, the king interpreted this in the worst possible way. Will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house? It was almost certainly not what Haman was doing. He was pleading for mercy, not assaulting the queen. But in that moment, with the king's fury already at its peak, the sight of Haman on the queen's couch was enough to seal his fate. As soon as the words left the king's mouth, attendants covered Haman's face, the traditional gesture indicating that someone was condemned to death. Then one of the eunuchs, a man named Harbona, spoke up with information that would determine Haman's method of execution. A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The irony was perfect. The pole Haman had prepared for Mordecai, built to exactly the specifications Haman had wanted, tall enough to be visible throughout the city, designed to be the instrument of his enemy's destruction, that pole was available. And Harbona helpfully reminded the king that Mordecai was the one who had saved the king's life by exposing the assassination plot. The king's command was immediate and emphatic. Impale him on it. So they took Haman and impaled him on the very pole he had prepared for Mordecai. The instrument of death he had designed for his enemy became the means of his own execution. The height he had chosen to make Mordecai's humiliation visible throughout the city now made his own death visible instead. Every detail of his plot, the pride that drove it, the pole that would execute it, the timing he had chosen, all of it collapsed back upon him. And with Haman's death, the king's fury subsided. Justice had been done, at least in the king's mind. The threat to the queen had been eliminated. The villain had been punished. But there was still one enormous problem that Haman's death did not solve. Justice reversed. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. It was substantial. Haman had been wealthy, with properties and possessions that now belonged to the queen. It was partial restitution, a transfer of the oppressor's wealth to one of his intended victims. Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had revealed how they were related. She explained that this was the man who had raised her, who had watched over her, who was like a father to her. The relationship that had been kept secret was now made known, and with that revelation came honor. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And this was the same ring that had sealed the decree of death. Now it was being given to the very man who had been targeted for execution. Mordecai was being elevated to the position Haman had held, second only to the king in authority. Esther appointed him over Haman's estate, so he was not only in possession of political power, but also of material resources. It was a complete reversal. The man marked for death was now in the highest position. The man who refused to bow was now honored by the king. The intended victim inherited the oppressor's wealth and authority. Justice in personal terms had been served, but the original problem remained. Haman was dead, but his edict was still in effect. The decree calling for the destruction of all Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month had been issued under the king's seal. And Persian law was absolute. Once issued, a royal decree could not be revoked. It did not matter that Haman was dead, that his plot had been exposed, that the king now regretted his decision. The law was the law, and the machinery of death was still in motion. Esther had to approach the king again. She fell at his feet and wept, begging him with tears to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, to overturn the dispatches he had written to destroy the Jews throughout the king's provinces. The king extended the gold scepter to Esther again, granting her safety again, receiving her favorably again, and she rose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, her voice carrying the weight of desperation, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" It was a plea that combined legal petition with personal anguish. She was asking for a legal solution to overrule the existing decree, but she was also expressing the emotional reality. How could she live knowing that her people would be destroyed? How could she continue as queen while her family, her community, her entire ethnic group was being annihilated? King Xerxes responded with a solution that acknowledged both the authority he had given away and the limitations of his own power. "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." The king was admitting the problem. The first decree could not be undone, but he was authorizing a second decree that could counter it. He was giving Mordecai and Esther full authority to draft whatever orders they thought necessary to protect the Jewish people, and he was giving them his signet ring to make those orders official and irrevocable. On the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, Mordecai summoned the royal secretaries. This was only 2 months and 10 days after the first decree had been issued. Time was of the essence, and as the date for the destruction was still 9 months away, the secretaries wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. The orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language, making absolutely sure that everyone would understand what was being communicated. The new decree granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves. They were authorized to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed forces of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The language deliberately echoed the first decree. The same words Haman had used, destroy, kill, annihilate, were now being turned around, giving the Jews legal authorization to defend themselves against anyone who tried to carry out Haman's plan. This was to take effect on the same day chosen by Haman, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. So on that date there would be 2 conflicting decrees in effect, one authorizing the destruction of the Jews, and one authorizing the Jews to defend themselves against anyone attempting to destroy them. The legal situation was complex, but the practical effect was clear. The Jews would not be defenseless victims. They would have the legal right and practical means to fight back. The dispatches were sent out by couriers on the king's fast horses, spurred on by the king's command. The speed was important. The message needed to reach every corner of the empire as quickly as possible, giving the Jewish communities time to prepare, giving potential attackers warning that the Jews were now legally protected and authorized to defend themselves. In Susa, the decree was published immediately, and Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. The description emphasizes his elevation. These were not his usual official robes, but garments that marked him as someone of extraordinary status and authority. He was being honored publicly, visibly, in a way that everyone could see. The city of Susa held a joyous celebration. This is a striking detail. Not just the Jews, but the entire city celebrated. On the earlier bewilderment when Haman's decree was issued had given way to relief in celebration when justice was restored. The citizens of Susa recognized that something right had been done, that a terrible wrong had been corrected. For the Jews throughout the empire, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. The emotional language piles up: happiness, joy, gladness, honor, trying to capture the overwhelming relief and celebration that swept through Jewish communities as the news reached them. They had been facing certain death. Now they had legal protection and the right to defend themselves. The reversal was complete. In every province and in every city where the edict of the king reached, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews, either converting genuinely or claiming Jewish identity for protection, because fear of the Jews had seized them. This last detail is significant. The reversal was so complete, the shift in power dynamics so dramatic, that people were actually afraid of the Jews. Now the group that had been marked for destruction was seen as powerful and dangerous. Whether this was a good thing or simply a pragmatic response to changed circumstances, it represented a total transformation of the Jewish people's status in the empire. A nation preserved. The 13th day of Adar arrived, the day that had been chosen by Haman through the casting of lots, the day that was supposed to mark the destruction of the Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire. But when that day came, the tables had been completely turned. Instead of being victims, the Jews were defenders. Instead of being destroyed, they struck down their enemies. On that day, the Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those who were seeking their ruin. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. This fear was not just fear of the Jews themselves, but fear of what they represented: the favor of the king, the protection of the queen, the authority of Morai, who now held the second highest position in the empire. All the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Morai had seized them. Morai had become prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The officials who were supposed to maintain order and enforce the king's decrees were now actively helping the Jews defend themselves, because they understood that opposing the Jews meant opposing Morai, and opposing Morai meant opposing someone with direct access to the king's authority. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. The language emphasizes the Jews' agency and power. They did what they pleased. They were not constrained or limited. Those who had planned to attack them and plunder their goods found themselves on the receiving end of violence instead. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman: Pashantha, Dalon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisi, Aridi, Aranvisatha. The text carefully lists all their names, marking their deaths as the final elimination of Haman's line and legacy. But then comes an important detail: but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This is repeated multiple times in the account. The Jews killed their enemies but did not take their possessions. This was significant because the second decree had authorized them to plunder the property of their enemies, just as Haman's original decree had authorized the destruction of the Jews and the plundering of their goods. But the Jews chose not to exercise this right. They were defending themselves, eliminating the threat, but not enriching themselves through their enemies' deaths. It was a statement that this was about survival and justice, not about greed or opportunism. When the king learned that 500 men had been killed in Susa, along with Haman's 10 sons, he asked Esther what else she wanted. The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted. Essa made two requests. First, she asked for the Jews in Susa to be given permission to carry out tomorrow's edict today as well, essentially extending the period of authorized self-defense for one more day in the capital city. Second, she asked that the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles, displayed publicly as a warning and a symbol of complete defeat. Both requests were granted. So on the 14th day of the month of Adar, the Jews in Susa came together again and killed 300 more men in Susa. Again, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the other Jews in the provinces assembled to protect themselves and got relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 who hated them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. The numbers are striking. 75,000 killed throughout the provinces. This was not a small skirmish, but a substantial conflict indicating that many people throughout the empire had been prepared to attack the Jews when Haman's decree took effect. The threat had been real. The danger had been widespread. Without the second decree authorizing self-defense, the slaughter would have gone in the other direction. This all happened on the 13th day of Adar. On the 14th, the Jews rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on both the 13th and 14th. And then on the 15th, they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. This created two slightly different traditions: Jews in rural areas celebrating on the 14th of Adar, and Jews in Susa, and later otherwise recorded these events carefully. He was not just a participant, but a chronicler, someone who understood the importance of preserving the memory of what had happened. He sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, establishing that they should celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. The Jews agreed to continue the practice they had begun, taking on themselves and their descendants, and all who joined them, the obligation to observe these 2 days without fail, according to the written instructions and at the designated time every year. These days were to be remembered and observed in every generation by every family in every province and in every city. These days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated among the Jews, and the memory of these days should never perish among their descendants. The celebration was called Purim from the Persian word pur, meaning lot, because Haman had cast lots to determine the date for the Jews' destruction. The very mechanism Haman had used to choose the timing of genocide, leaving it to chance to the casting of lots, became the name for the festival, celebrating the reversal of his plot. What was meant to be random and arbitrary became instead the name for a holiday celebrating divine providence. Working through seemingly ordinary events, Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim, establishing these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. The story ends with administrative details, the establishment of an annual celebration, the recording of events, the securing of memory for future generations. But underneath these practical details is a profound recognition. And this was not just a lucky escape or a fortunate turn of events. This was something worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth passing down to children and grandchildren. This was a moment when everything could have gone wrong, but instead went right. When destruction was turned into deliverance, when mourning became dancing. Epilogue. Providence in the shadows. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and the empire continued its normal functioning. The crisis had passed. Life went on, and all the acts of King Xerxes' power and might together, with a full account of the greatness of Mirai to whom the king had promoted him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mirai the Jew was second in ranked King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. It is a quiet ending to such a dramatic story. There are no supernatural fireworks, no angels appearing with flaming swords, no miraculous plague striking down enemies. The account ends with administrative notes about tribute and historical records, with Mirai continuing his work in the Persian government, using his position to benefit his people. It seems almost anticlimactic after all the drama that preceded it, but that quiet ending is precisely the point.